Hello and welcome to another edition of Sri's Sunday New York Times Read Along. Yes, we're back with a live show. It's been a few weeks, but we are thrilled to have Samuel G. Freedman, award winning author, former New York Times columnist, and Columbia Journalism School professor, as our guest. Our host, of course, is Sri Srinivasan. He's the CEO and co founder of Digimentors. My name is Neil Parekh. I am the executive producer of the show. We're live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and our Digimentors website. Please like, please comment, please share. Let us know where you're watching from. And if you're watching on Facebook, make sure to press play on the video so we can share your comments on the screen. We have another great show planned for today. Sam is going to walk us through his new book about Hubert Humphrey. Here's just a little bit of a preview. Freedman tells a surprising and rare history of Black and Jewish Americans fighting against racism and anti Semitism, often side by side, in a northern city before the civil rights era. His brilliant profiles of these local heroes are gripping and, in many ways, the spine of the book. This is from the New York Times book review from earlier this year. The book is Into the Bright Sunshine, Young Hubert Humphrey and the Fight for Civil Rights. We'll have more on the book a little bit later, and Sam will walk us through several pictures. We'll also, of course, review the Sunday Times. We have the New York Times Kids section this week, a special print-only section. So we're looking forward to seeing that, and of course, the news of the week. Again, please let us know where you're watching from, and we can put your comments on the screen. First up, we want to welcome Diane Stefani, saying, welcome back to the New York Times Read Along team. Diane, thank you for having us. Thank you for joining us, rather. As I mentioned earlier, it's been a few weeks between the end of summer and some scheduling changes, but we are back and we have several shows lined up for the rest of the fall. So stay tuned and keep an eye on announcements. Naomi Service, it's a soggy good morning from the Upper West Side. Can't wait to hear the show. Hubert Humphrey was terribly underrated. Couldn't agree more. And I'll say, when I did my research for the show, and I mentioned this to Sam when we spoke, I did not know the history at all. You'll hear about Hubert Humphrey's speech at the Democratic Convention that really kicked off the civil rights era for the Democrats, really led them. And to a certain extent, it may have saved us from a Strom Thurmond presidency. We'll ask Sam about that a little bit later. Pradnya Haldapur is saying good morning from rainy Silver Spring. It's pretty rainy in Springfield, Virginia, where I am as well. And I should reference, just in case folks don't know, Strom Thurmond was a longtime segregationist senator from South Carolina who ran as a Dixiecrat against Harry Truman. He may have won if blacks hadn't turned out for the vote. But we'll learn more about that in a little bit. My mom is watching from Hastings on Hudson. Very rainy there, and I'm pretty sure the Sawmill River Parkway is flooding where she is. Mom, I'm glad that we get to talk during the week a few times. Obviously, I haven't been able to say hi to you the last several weeks on the show, but thank you again, as always, for watching. And we have Patricia Freudenberg watching on LinkedIn. Patricia is another longtime viewer and regular viewer of the show. So we are thrilled to have you here as well. Please like, please comment, please share, let your friends know, retweet on Twitter, and we will have a great conversation with Sam Freedman. Hopefully folks know, but we'll also hear about his work as a professor of journalism at the Columbia Journalism School. He's a very, very popular professor there. I know someone, in fact, who wants to audit one of his courses again several years after she finished the MA program there. So we will talk about his work at Columbia J School. He's also a former New York Times columnist. Sri, I don't know how you're going to do it, but there's a lot to cover in today's show. Let's bring on Sri Srinivasan. Sri, good to see you. How are you?
Good morning. Good morning. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're thrilled to have you all with us. Neil, great to be back with you on the show. And we have so much to cover today. For those of you who haven't seen this in action before, every Sunday, 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time, we read the print New York Times. Don't ask why. We've been doing it for 8 years. And we're live on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, and on Digimentors.group. We're so grateful to our sponsor, Muckrack, for making it possible for us to do this show for all of these years. So here's cheers to Muckrack. And we would love to have more sponsors, of course. Everybody does. So if you'd like to join us, please email neil@digimentors.group or sri@digimentors.group. And this is a production of Digimentors, the startup that Andrew Lee and I co-founded. And we work on digital marketing, strategic communications, training, workshops, events and programs like this. If you want a podcast, let us know. Staffing and recruiting. And I'm doing these AI workshops around the country and in many countries around the world. Would love to talk to you about that. Check out digimentors.group. That's how I started teaching. Sam will recognize me as having hair in that. And then the very first non-scary guide to AI that I taught was very important to me, that I do it at the Southern Poverty Law Center retreat. They're an amazing organization that we're blessed to work with. They helped kill the Klan and bring down those statues. And so if you're interested in this, also please get in touch. And we have a full agenda today. We have so much that we have to talk to you about. We will be talking about the Times. We'll be talking about Sam's latest book. We'll be talking about his book class, a legendary book class that has had more than 100 book contracts and coming up to 100 published books. He's been teaching for 35 years. I was honored to be his colleague for all of those years and partner in many crimes at Columbia. And you can hear him there. I'm just going to scoot the camera over just so you can say hi for a minute and we'll come back to him. There he is.
Good
morning. Sam Freedman. Thank you. We started the morning, Sam, by having bagels together and coffee, and that to me seemed the right thing to do with Sam. Nothing more New York than having bagels and reading the print New York Times. But here's a headline for some folks that Sam doesn't always read the print New York Times. So tell us about that, Sam.
I know, it's just the, I was, such a print diehard for many, many years. I mean, I started with print journalism, reading the New York Times in my parents' home, starting about 1961 or 62. The first job I ever had was being a newspaper delivery boy for the New Brunswick, New Jersey Home News. Little factoid, the first paper that Robert Caro ever worked on as a reporter. And in the last few years, though, I'd found myself increasingly reading the Times on my laptop, but then more and more and more on this little thing. And so actually earlier this year, I finally made what felt like a dramatic step and changed my subscription from 7 days of home delivery to the weekend, but of course keeping my digital subscription. I do believe in paying for intellectual property.
Good. I think that's important. But people will be surprised that you are reading so much of it on your phone, especially. You don't have the biggest phone in the world, and so that's important. The main thing is the content, and you said something very important just before we started, that the size of the paper was obviously bigger on Sundays. It used to weigh, it seemed like half a ton back in the 80s, 90s, even early 2000s. You're saying that's not necessarily the measure of success of content.
Right. I mean, I hear, especially being a journalism professor as well as a Times alumnus, a lot of, hand-wringing about the paper's so much smaller now. People remember when the Sunday Times stacked up in newsstands would be this thick. In fact, there used to be a greeting card you could buy in New York with just a photo of New York Sunday Times as piled up, waiting. And it was a whole thing to go out on late Saturday night and buy the Sunday paper and, have it there with you for your coffee and bagels in the morning. But I actually think there's more amazing content in the Times now than there was then, because at that time, everything the Times was producing was on a piece of paper. And now what's on the pieces of paper we're going to go through is a fraction of what's there. There's so much additional content online, podcasts, videography, things the Times would never have thought of going into. In fact, when I was on the Times in my first period there in the 80s as a staff reporter, There was a lot of ambivalence about broadcast media within the Times. They were even a little bit reluctant about how they wanted to cover it because they were so concerned that visual news was gonna take away the Times' franchise in a way. And now you have amazing documentaries like the Britney Spears documentary that the Times did, and you have, of course, podcasts like The Daily and all sorts of content beyond what's in print. And I think there's also a lot of, print work that exists or sort of.
And Sri, we lost audio. So Sri is showing a bit of the paper. And we will get back to Sam in just a moment. Again, I want to remind folks of the book. Here's another card, Sam Freedman's book, Into the Bright Sunshine, Young Hubert Humphrey and the Fight for Civil Rights. Long before the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts of the mid-1960s, Freedman argues Humphrey led Minneapolis to become virtually the only city in America where a victim of racial discrimination could count on the government as an ally. Freedman's book shows how this happened. It is a superbly written tale of moral and political courage for present day readers who find themselves in similarly dark times. Again, we are thrilled to have Sam Freedman as our guest on the show, and we'll get back to Sri and Sam.
Hi, folks. Thanks very much, Neil. We have so much to cover here. I'm going to just pull up my New York Times camera so that people can take a look. Neil, is everything good? And
Sri, unfortunately, we're losing your audio when we pull up the New York Times camera. So I don't know if Sri is hearing me. But again, Sri, we lost your audio again when we pulled up the camera. I don't know why that happened. So you're gonna have to unmute your.
Yeah, sorry, we're having tech
Not
difficulties.
sure. We've had it happen once or twice, but not like this. So
well, we'll be fine. So
I have the paper here if we need it.
Yeah. So let's look at the paper together, Sam, as we read the front section. The cover is Senator's Case Reveals a Trail of Lavish Gifts. This is about Menendez portrayed as peddling influence. And tell us about stories like this, New Jersey stories of graft and corruption are things that people have heard for a long time. Even this senator was in trouble before. What do you think is going to happen here?
Well, I think when you get caught with gold bars in your basement, you're going to have a difficult time defending yourself. And I grew up in New Jersey. I started my political career in New Jersey. And I remember a former colleague of mine who'd also grown up in New Jersey and was a Vietnam veteran saying that there are two great divides among journalists: the divide between those who did and didn't cover Vietnam, and the divide between those who did and didn't cover New Jersey. And part of it is that there's been, unfortunately, this incredible pattern of corruption, maybe equaled only in Illinois. Menendez has barely escaped prosecution once before, but before him, you had Bob Torricelli, who also went down in a scandal. If any of you know the film American Hustle, it's kind of a slightly fictionalized story of a sting operation that, among other people, caught Senator Harrison Williams back in the 70s. So there's been a pretty wide berth, unfortunately, for corruption in New Jersey politics, notwithstanding some, really exceptionally gifted and legal operating politicians as well. But I'll be
Senator Bob Bradley,
Bill Bradley.
Bill Bradley, yeah. Sorry. Right. I think of Bob Menendez, yeah. So
no, I mean, so I'm obviously not an attorney, much less a prosecutor, but it seems to me it'd be a shock if Menendez can survive this one, because just, again, the money, the gold bars that cash, they found, cash, that's going to be very hard to explain away to a jury, I think.
One of the things that will be of concern to most folks who are watching would be, what does this mean for the balance in the Senate? From what you know about New Jersey politics, what would a Menendez successor successor's race look like?
Well, first of all, I think that's one reason Governor Murphy right away has called on Menendez to resign, because the prospect that Menendez might limp through the rest of his term and have to and stand for re-election would make him incredibly vulnerable. Whereas I think if he resigns, if Murphy appoints replacement, of course, be a Democrat, that person will have some time to get traction and to be elected. I mean, the parallel in terms of the replacement process, not the reason, is when Al Franken resigned as senator from Minnesota, which I think many of us believe now was a terrible injustice, a huge mistaken overreaction. And actually, I would encourage people, if you don't know the backstory, to dig out a piece Jane Mayer did in the New Yorker several years ago, probably 4 or 5 years ago, about really the planned hit on Franken that led to that by right-wing operatives. But nonetheless, when Al Franken resigned and Tina Smith was appointed, she had a couple of years to build her own resume up as a senator, and she's been able to win re-election in what's a purple state, trending blue, but probably no bluer state than New Jersey is. So I think the idea is that, at least on the part of Murphy, that if Menendez will resign, if you get someone else in there with a couple of years to build their own reputation, then it should remain a pretty safe seat. If you've damaged goods in the form of Menendez, even were he to get acquitted on these charges, trying to run again, then you've got someone who could be toppled.
Thank you. That's a very good analysis. And here, Neil's already found the case of Al Franken.
Thank you, Neil. That is a must read. That is a must read. And remember that Jane Mayer is not someone to ever excuse people for sexual harassment. She was one of the co-authors of the book about Clarence Thomas, Strange Justice, and the Anita Hill hearing. So when Jane Mayer is writing about the smear campaign planned against Franken, it has a lot of credibility.
Sure. And we just want to see who's watching. Let's see here. Arlene Schulman says, hello from Upper Manhattan. And Nicole Nerlius is watching from Delhi. Okay. And Paula Kiger is watching from Tallahassee, Florida. And hey,
Paula Kiger, I'll be in Tallahassee in December.
Oh, nice. With the book?
Doing a book tour? Yeah. Speaking at Temple of Israel and at Florida State.
Oh, wonderful. So I'm sure Paula will note that and spread the word. Thank you, Paula. Great longtime producer of the show. And did you ever make it to Delhi?
No, I have not made it to Delhi yet. I barely made, like everyone else, I hardly left the country for 3.5 years. Yeah. So international travel is just starting to pick up again for me and my family and my wife.
And tell us about your relationship with Upper Manhattan.
Well, my relationship with Upper Manhattan is having been at Columbia, starting as an adjunct in 1990, starting on full-time faculty in 93. And, Sri, I know you've had this experience. The people who aren't New Yorkers think of it as the big impersonal city, but to me, it is this series of small towns. And it's really remarkable if you think of where most New Yorkers live, other than what commute you might make to your job, how much of your social life, your dining out, other things happens within maybe 20 blocks in one direction or the other. And so for me, Upper West Side and Morningside Heights has been, what's Faulkner's phrase, a postage stamp of native soil.
Oh, wow. The beautiful line. And Rupa and I moved from the Upper West Side, which is its own lovely little neighborhood, to a different lovely neighborhood right nearby the UN. And you're right. Now it seems to me like a trek to go up there. And I'm glad you made the trek down here to come see us.
I'll always make it. And, I don't know if your viewers and listeners know the famous Sri and Rupa Diwali parties that were always held.
Yeah, so we have to start them again after the pandemic. And I know you were a serious and devoted attendee. We should tell everybody about your latke parties.
Yes, well, those have been retired for the moment again. To some extent,
but at the night of 1,000 latkes.
Night of 1,000 latkes, and I didn't quite get to 1,000, but I probably over the course of the 4 or 5 hours probably made several hundred. So,
wow.
So there was all sort of aspirated oil in the apartment, and I ended up with a sheen of it on myself, but very happy.
Yes, and Melissa Lutke says, great to have Sam as your Sunday morning guest. Hello from Cambridge, Massachusetts.
And hello, Melissa. Congratulations on your book about being one of the groundbreaking female sports journalists. It was great to see that come out.
Oh, nice. And tell us about Boston, the Boston area, Cambridge. You've been there, of course, many times.
I've been there, a fair number of times. Not, I haven't spent as much time there in my life as I've spent in other places like Chicago or Minneapolis. But I've been up there to give different talks. I've been up there to report different stories. Back before my legs suffered from too many years of running in a row, was one of my most favorite places to run, was on the paths along the Charles River. So
oh, nice. And I was in Boston yesterday and was along the Charles yesterday. So here's Mary C. Curtis. Good morning, Sri, and my former New York Times colleague,
yes.
Sam, not from Charlotte this morning, but on vacation in Carlsbad, California. Looking forward to the conversation. Thank you, Mary.
Yeah, Mary, good timing to get away from the tropical storm, too.
Yeah. The storm is outside our window
Yes.
here in New York. So, Sam, we have the full newspaper. We've gotten through one story on the front page.
Right.
And so this will be about 8-10 hours, like you're making your latkes. So
Yeah.
we got to pick this up a little bit. On the front page also is making the planet glisten with gold while poisoning it in the process. A gold mine in Suriname, liquid mercury, has long harmed the country's population. No clear fix to fight or fix the fentanyl crisis. In New York, open use near daycare center. Just terrible stuff like this. The Smithsonian's Latino Museum, unbuilt, raises political furor. So I have not followed that. There's been a lot of news about the Women's Museum.
Right. Well, I think if I remember correctly, the Latino Museum was one that I think was Rand Paul and some of the other right wingers were trying to vote against even authorizing, claiming that this was, racial separatism or something like that. I'm pretty sure I'm remembering that correctly. The fentanyl story I'd read start to finish, and it's a very penetrating, really harrowing story. And what it's really about is at a time when overdoses are rising, drug dealing is happening more in the open, which way do you go in dealing with it? Do you ramp back up police enforcement and prosecution, or do you go with basically de facto or actually official decriminalization? And that's a really hard choice to imagine because, the war on drugs approach, as the story points out, had a lot of collateral social damage when that was the way to go. But there's also no question that the pervasiveness of things, of the use and people, nodding off while they're high on fentanyl is a lot more visible. And it's interesting, I spend partly because of my wife's family ties and partly because of my research on the Hubert Humphrey book, a big chunk of every year in Minneapolis, and even more than in New York, the fentanyl epidemic there is really visible. And the light rail public transit stop near where I have an office there at the University of Minnesota is a place where really every day I see scorched pieces of aluminum foil from where people were smoking fentanyl and people are passed out. So this is a real nationwide challenge.
And I remember in the 90s, we used to see crack files and make assumptions about a neighborhood and everything else. A culinary road trip is the New York Times has the 50 restaurants in the U.S. they're most excited about. There's a whole special section, apparently. And as young people stream away, networks bet on boomer taste. And of course, we have a boomer here who is unpredictable. He's reading the Times on his phone. And are you a streamer?
I am a streamer. It's although I still one of those boomers who actually has a cable TV subscription too. But no, my wife and I do an enormous amount of streaming. And actually, one of the things we've really appreciated is, it's been such a golden era for documentary filmmaking in the last 10 or 15 years, and to be able to fetch all kinds of documentaries just by searching for them has been a real pleasure for us. I mean, we certainly watch feature films, and we have our episodic series like Better Call Saul that we're totally devoted. Totally devoted to. But for documentaries, which used to be really hard to chase down, you'd maybe see them on PBS, or here in Manhattan, you might be fortunate to see one at Film Forum. But now this bounty of great nonfiction filmmaking is available through streaming.
Yeah, and you heard that here from Sam's choices for things to stream. Melissa says the book is still forthcoming. My book about equal rights case against This is coming out in August 2024, and Neil's already booking her for the show,
Good.
so that's great. And
Sri, I'll point out that's Commissioner Bowie Kuhn, who is the
Mhm.
Major League Baseball commissioner. Melissa did incredible work to get into the locker room
Right.
in Major League Baseball. So we'll definitely have her on the show next year. I'm going to
Mhm.
make sure we do that.
When you talk about that case and the work that Melissa did in bringing it reminds me of one of my favorite books about journalism, was by a longtime New York Times colleague and friend of mine named Nan Robertson, and it was called The Girls in the Balcony. And that was a book about a sex discrimination case um, brought by women on the New York Times in late 60s or early 70s, having to do with unequal pay and lack of promotions. And that was sort of the battle within the newsroom, and very much in the same time period as these battles that female sports journalists had to get access.
Yeah, we should also, while talking about sports, we should mention the end of the New York Times sports section. It officially happened a couple of weeks ago, but we were able to have a terrific, sad but worthy conversation about the history of the New York Times sports section with some fantastic speakers, including two wonderful women sports journalists. So Laurie Mifflin, Claire Smith, George Vesey, and Bill Roden were all on the show.
Wow.
And I call that my murderer's row, if you know
Yeah.
the Yankees, the 27 Yankees. And it was a celebration at a time when there's a lot of concern about what will happen to the journalists who were there. John Branch and others tweeted and shared our session as well. John's an example of someone who's a great sports journalist, but is a great journalist. And that's the important part.
I agree. I mean, someone like John Branch is going to do fantastic work, whatever he's working on. But, I've loved many of the writers in the Times sports section over the years. I worked with a lot of them in my years at the Times. But one of those people, Robert Lipsyte, who was a great columnist when I was growing up and really one of the leaders in writing about sports and society, and then went on later to write books and to be the ombudsperson at ESPN. Bob Lipsyte had a really good essay after the Times shut down the sports section, pointing out that there was this paradox all along, which is that the Times had terrific people in the sports section, but always seemed ill at ease with making a real full-fledged commitment to covering sports. There's kind of a built-in ambivalence about it, and probably people like Laurie and Bill Roden, George Vesey, all folks who I knew quite well, would probably attest to that. And I'm not saying this is any kind of an argument for shutting down the section, but I think that the Athletic has been a really good quality sports journalism operation in and of itself. And so I think that the Times made a fairly ruthless decision, but to resolve what was a little bit of an internal contradiction of having a sports section and yet feeling somehow that sports wasn't quite Timesian enough. And that had been built in for decades.
So I can't blame it all on the Athletic. I want to say that Richard Deitch, our former student, is one of the great columnists at the Athletic and a wonderful supporter of this show as well. We have so much to get through. That's Sam Freedman. I'm Sri Srinivasan. We're talking about the New York Times. We're also talking about his book, which is Into the Bright Sunshine. This is a galley copy. I was lucky to get one early, but Neil's put the cover up properly so you can see it. Young Hubert Humphrey and the Fight for Civil Rights. We're going to be talking about this. We're going to talk about his legendary book class at Columbia Journalism School, where we were together for 20 years. I think we started officially on the same day as full-time professors, but Sam has been there for 35 years. I bowed out at 20. And his class has produced more than 100 accepted book contracts and almost 100 books. So he'll talk about all of that in just a moment. Let's see who's watching. Linda's watching from Drizzly, Long Island. Jonathan Borstein is watching from the East Village. And Melissa's already said yes to the invitation, 2024. Everyone, mark your calendars.
Get on your calendar.
Yeah, we do the show Sunday mornings, 8:30 to 10 a.m., talking about the New York Times with fascinating guests. This is our first in person in my home in about 3 years. We have done it in a couple of other places, but this is the first time at home. And so we're trying different ways to tell the story. Before we do that, since we mentioned the class, and we mentioned different neighborhoods, I want to put up a quote about Sam from one of his former students who's already said hi on the show. So we're going to bring that quote up. This is Arlene Schulman says, "I was a diamond in the rough before I took Simon's book writing class at Columbia. With heart-stopping fear, he rid me of cliches such as it was dark and stormy night and sentences that run on for miles without a care in the world for a period at the end of my thoughts. We've only scratched the surface here. Rather than open a can of worms on a day where it's expected to rain cats and dogs, let me make my pearl of wisdom short and sweet. Thanking my lucky stars for a great writer and teacher."
Well, look, I always say when people ask me about the class that one of the keys to it is having Columbia J School students. So you start with the self-selecting group of incredibly committed, intellectually curious people. And the other thing is it's always been a class that's been like the J School as a whole, ungraded. I can't tell you.
This pass-fail, we should.
Yeah, pass-fail, right. I can't tell you what a difference that makes when you're trying to edit people's work that no one's worried about what their letter grade or grade point is going to be. But Arlene has an amazing background. We're talking about women in sports journalism.
Yeah.
Arlene was doing work on boxing, has a wonderful book. Arlene, put up in the chat if you can, because it's failing my aging memory now, the title of your book of photographs and profiles of prize fighters, which I have a copy of on my shelf at home. And, it's always been a big kick for me to be able to work with people who generally Arlene's a rare exception, someone who had a book already. Most of the people who take the class, probably 95% of them have not ever written a book or even contemplated it. Some of them have never had a word really published professionally anywhere. And to think that you could, help someone get from 0 to 60 really within 15 weeks, which is the length of the class, and try to get people to the point where they have a proposal that a publisher will acquire. That's just been, that's like half of my life's work right there.
Wow, that's
the other half is my book.
is your books, and you even taught other classes. You didn't only teach book writing, but that became your signature,
right?
And what you were best known for. People would fight to get into your class and plead and beg, and they would. When I was on the administration side, they would come up to see if there's anything can be done, and we said no. Sam has total power over that class.
Well, it's true, but the one thing I've tried to do to keep it as fair as possible is I have a couple of rules. One is I don't talk to anybody about their book idea until I open applications to everybody, so no one gets an early start. And I don't take recommendations from even other faculty members. People get in solely on the basis of the book they're proposing to write. I've in a couple of times over the years admitted people who I had on academic probation in an earlier class.
I remember this.
And one of them has gone on to a wonderful, illustrious book writing career. So I don't even disfavor people who,
who you disfavor.
Who I disfavored, who had me tearing my hair in a prior class.
And you were willing to have them on. I don't know how many people would be willing to do that.
Well, if they have a great book topic, I want to have them in the class.
Sure. So I think we're looking at the book jacket of Arlene's book, and this is great to see it here. She has 7 books. So one of them was about great prize fighters.
Yeah, Arlene's a spectacular photojournalist.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you, Neil, for sharing it. And Dr. Tachi is watching from Fort Lauderdale. She has a great Instagram show. Everyone, please follow her on all the platforms. And Eliza Boxer says, there's a whole lot of awesomeness right there, Sri and Sam.
Yeah.
At heart. Thank you so much, Eliza.
Oh, hey, and Elisa up in Maine. Elisa is an incredible author of nonfiction young adult books, several of which I've bought for my step-grandson. So Elisa's had this amazing career, super successful in YA nonfiction. Maybe we can show some of her.
Yeah, she can put her titles in the comments, and we'll take a look.
Yeah, so Elisa was someone, she wasn't in my book writing class. She was in the basic reporting class and really, really excelled in that. So not surprised that you would move into books. Yeah.
So speaking of books, we're going to look at the book review. So tell us about the book review and its place in the world. The cover is Mr. X, Elon Musk. Walter Isaacson's biography of the billionaire entrepreneur depicts a mercurial man-child with grandiose ambitions and an ego to match. And this is an example of what you were talking about. I read this maybe 10 days ago,
Right.
maybe 20 days ago. I don't remember. And here it is on the cover of the book jacket.
Yeah, it's a little bit asymmetrical. I mean, first of all, being a nonfiction author myself and teaching a book class, this is like holy writ for me, is the New York Times Sunday Book Review. And partly, it's always been hugely important, but all the more so because up until the Washington Post brought back its Book World section about, I don't know, 6 months or so ago as a standalone Sunday book section, for the previous probably 5 to 10 years, the Times Book Review was the only freestanding book section left in an American newspaper. There had been a gigantic contraction. You used to have standalone book sections. The LA Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Chicago Tribune, the Chicago Sun-Times, of course, the Washington Post. So the Times was hugely important, and it still is. Jennifer Shalai's review of the Isaacson biography is very, very trenchant, and I think I would encourage people to read that review in parallel with the terrific review that Jill Lepore wrote in the New Yorker, which makes some similar points, but she has more length, so she can really air it out. But both of them, I think, make some really important points, not only about Musk as a person, but about something I know, Sri, we talked about with journalism ethics, which is what's called access journalism, which is when you get the chance to have access to your subject while that subject is still alive and someone who's hard to get to, like Elon Musk, does that turn even an experienced, very respected journalist like Walter Isaacson? Does it make you go soft on the person who you're around? I don't think that is inevitable. Like the Tim Alberta profile in The Atlantic a few months ago of Chris Licht at CNN, which was the end of Licht's time there. That was a great example of someone who had access and didn't get made too sympathetic to their subject because they so appreciated having the access. But it's a common point that flows through both Shalai and Lepore's reviews of the Isaacson biography of Musk, that there is a real downside to being able to be the fly on the wall of a famous person.
I completely agree, and I recommend also Gary Steingart's review in The Guardian, which is actually funnier than all of these, but makes the cover similar ground.
Gary Steingart being Gary Steingardt, there are going to be some laugh lines.
Yeah, there was great laugh. Every line is a laugh line, but also really sad because you'd be crying otherwise with everything that Musk is doing to the world.
Yeah.
And I also encourage you to listen to Kara Swisher, another Columbia J School alum.
Yes.
Her interview with Isaacson, a podcast that just dropped a few days ago. He refuses to come down on, saying what he thinks of Musk. After all of that, he says, "Let my work will stand for itself and will speak for itself," and everything else. And he had a chance multiple times to take responsibility for what he's done.
That's really disturbing default to me, because to me, part of the point of writing biography is you are making a judgment of a life. That part of a biographer's role is to, not just chronicle the life, but to make value judgments of it. If you don't want to do a value judgment, I mean, it should be judicious, it should be well researched. But if you don't want to make the judgment, you probably shouldn't be writing a book. You should be doing a more conventional newspaper profile in which it's not within your mandate to come to those kinds of judgments.
Here's the piece, or one of the many pieces that we're talking about, and there's a Kara Swisher podcast.
Yeah, I'm going to have to catch up on that. I have not heard that yet.
Yeah, please do. I just wanted to show folks that Lawrence Wright is the profile here, or the interview, and he said, "What books are in your nightstand?" I just finished Elaine Pagel's Why Religion, and replaced with The Sullivanians by Alexander Stiller,
which
who
I
is
just
our
finished
colleague.
reading.
Yeah, so tell us about that book, because I didn't know about Sandro's new book.
Yeah, so The Sillivanians, written by our friend and my colleague, Alexander, or as everyone calls him, Sandro Stille, is a book about this cult that existed on the Upper West Side from basically the late 50s till about 1991. And it was set up by someone who purported to be a psychiatrist named Saul Newton, who actually had no such training, although he attracted a group of psychiatrists and psychologists to it. And like so many of these failed utopias, it starts out with this idea of we're going to liberate people from their, socially conservative, restrictive families and their oppressive parents. We're going to create, a place that encourages creativity and free sex and, alternative living arrangements and communal, sharing of food and so on. And what it becomes instead is, autocratic, dictatorial, a community, or not a community, a pseudo community in which parents are forced to give up their own children in infancy, in which couples who fall in love are urged to sleep with other people so that they don't end up having, a bonded relationship with one another. And it's a story that flows through, so many stories of failed utopias. This one is extremely grim, but this is a narrative that I'm always drawn to, partly because my father grew up in an anarchist community in New Jersey, and it didn't end up with this kind of catastrophe of the Sillivanians, but it ended up with a lot of mixed feelings and hurt feelings out of the effort to make a utopia. And so when I was reading Sandra's book, it also brought to mind a couple of novels in this area that I've really, really appreciated over the years. Lauren Groff's novel, Arcadia, and Columbia alum Leah Hager-Cohn's novel, No Book But the World. And those are also two terrific fictional examinations of the attempt to create a utopia and what we might call utopia and its discontents.
Wow. We have friend Ron Thomas. Greetings from Dubai. Glad you're back. Ron, who's from New Jersey.
Morehouse.
And Ron sat across from me in the last one of these that we did, one of the last that we did in my old apartment on the Upper West Side. And Melissa says, Swisher's podcast with Walter goes deep, then yes, ends shallow with Walter's reluctance. And Ellen is saying to one of her friends, Patricia Morrill, listen, the Sillivanians, listen, this is not the topic, but listen. So everyone tag a friend. They can watch us live or later on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, or Digimentors.group. This is how we do this every Sunday morning.
And there's another book, as long as there's a book review there, that my wife, who is an artist and graphic designer, brought to my attention. Seems really interesting, which is a book about 4 classical composers and their response to the Holocaust.
Oh, wow.
So it's Schopenhauer, Shostakovich, Benjamin Britten. I can't remember who the 4th one is, but that was a particularly intriguing review. And interestingly, that was one I had not caught online first, because you're right. There's this, like, my book got this wonderful review,
which we're going to talk about in a second,
from Khalid Muhammad, that ran online, I think, in mid-July, and then like late August, the print version turned up, which was sort of like having a twofer. It's almost like there's a second review that had run, and when it's the kind of review you die for, you're happy to have it reappear.
All right, we're going to go right to the review. This is where he called your book riveting, and into the bright sunshine. It says at the top, Sam Freedman makes the case for, you probably can say it by heart, what he wrote there, case that Humphrey was part of the vanguard in the fight for civil rights. And let's just go up a little more. You can see some great pictures also they have in the book and online. And what is getting a review like this? You already gave it away a bit, but what does it mean for you to have a review, or any writer to have a good review, of course, in the Times, but even elsewhere? What does this mean, and how is it different from an Amazon review or the popular reviews?
Well, I think, look, personally, I own it. I'm a snob. I've always said I'd rather win the Pulitzer Prize and have a bestseller. And for me, having the regard of my peers, getting a review by a renowned historian like Khalid Muhammad means the world to me. It's even more powerful that has the amplification of being in the New York Times. But getting the regard of some of the people who reviewed it, like Will Jones, who's also a great historian of the labor movement, who wrote for the Los Angeles Review of Books. And I'm blanking on his name, but a wonderful historian of civil rights who's at the University of Memphis, who reviewed it for the Washington Post. Getting that kind of regard is so important, both the recognition for the work, and it helps bring readers to it, of course, too. And it can help attract additional media attention to it. Because look, I spent 8.5 years on this book. And when you spend 8.5 years on a book you want it to be recognized one way or another, and fortunately there are different ways to do it. I was able, thank Ja, to get a lot of really positive review attention in what's been sort of traditional review media, like the Post and, in the Times, LA review books. But other people will find their traction through Goodreads, through Amazon reviews. And of course, Goodreads is now owned by Amazon, or through book clubs, through, ultimately word of mouth is the thing that moves any book. What you hope to do is that you get enough recognition, to get enough people reading and liking the book, that they start to tell your friends. So, for instance, I don't read my Amazon reviews. I've never read comment streams on the work I've written. I just don't go to those places. But what I have been looking at is the number of people who've reviewed the book for Amazon and Goodreads. And as long as that number keeps ticking up, then I feel like some kind of version of word of mouth is taking place. But I'll give you another example of a book that came out of my book writing class that's really caught on, that I think is probably a great example of what word of mouth as well as positive media can do, is Meg Kissinger's book, While You Were Out, which was about, it's sort of a reported memoir of her family's history of struggling with mental illness and substance abuse. And Meg had done extraordinary work on the Milwaukee Sentinel Journal on the mental health beat, and later taught classes at Columbia about that, and took my class while she was actually faculty college. But her book has gotten incredible traction. And I think that some of it is simply that people read it, know someone else who's in a similar situation in their life, tells them this is a book you got to read. And that's finally what makes books, happen or not happen in terms of getting a big readership.
Thank you, and so well put. And Meg, congrats on your book. I didn't know they had a staple in the book review section.
It's probably a good sign that there are enough, when there are enough pages that they need to staple.
Yeah,
that's a good thing.
I don't ever remember that. But here's Jill Lepore's new book.
Yeah,
collects 46 essays on subjects ranging from Herman Melville and Jane Franklin to feminism and AI. And we were just talking about Jill.
Yeah, well, she's one of these people, like, does this human being ever sleep? Because she has, it feels like every 2 or 3 issues of New Yorker, some essay that's incredibly deeply reported, whether it's about a book or comics or politics or history or whatever.
Yeah.
So I'm just kind of, like many people, in awe of her combination of volume and depth.
Yeah. Well, since we're talking about your book, let's take a look at excerpts from a lecture that you can give online that we're not going to do. Just a few photographs. Tell us about this book. Tell us, for the audience, we have an international audience. Sadly, the name Hubert Humphrey may not even mean much to everyone.
Right.
So a little bit of background.
Right. So Hubert Humphrey, if people know him at all, is best known for having been Lyndon Johnson's vice president from 64 to 68, the Democratic nominee for president who narrowly lost to Richard Nixon, also in 68, the candidate of sort of the Democratic establishment in 1972 who lost the Democratic nomination to George McGovern, who was the peace candidate. But there's a whole earlier part of his life that hardly anyone, even people who think they know about Humphrey, doesn't know about. And it ties into part of history that people don't know about. And I just want to walk through a couple of sets of images that really will help explain what drove the book. So, when most people think about the civil rights movement in America, they're thinking about the mid-1950s. They're thinking about, if you look at these images, Thurgood Marshall winning the Brown versus Board of Education decision from the Supreme Court, which outlawed school segregation, and Dr. King and Rosa Parks leading the Montgomery bus boycott, and then everything that follows on there, the freedom rides, the lunch counter sit-ins, and so on. But we tend to place the start of civil rights in the mid-50s. You can go to the next slide. And then when people think of Humphrey, and this goes to what I was just saying, they remember Humphrey pretty critically as the seemingly feckless vice president who was dominated by LBJ. You can see the famous photo of Humphrey getting what was called the Johnson treatment. The Humphrey who...
So this is where he's being dressed down.
Right. The Humphrey who supported the Vietnam War. The Humphrey who got his nomination for the presidential nomination from the Democrats during the 68 convention, which was this horror show of Mayor Daley's Chicago police beating down nonviolent anti-war protesters and journalists. And so, and then the Humphrey who died very young, Humphrey who died in 1966 while his reputation was still in tatters. And again, just like saying the civil rights movement began in the 50s, it's not that factually speaking, anything's wrong about Humphrey being regarded that way, but it's only part of the story. So we can go to the next image now, Sri. And what I want to do in this book is really fill a biographical hole and a historical hole. And the historical hole is that the civil rights movement we think we know from the mid-50s is impossible, could never have happened without the civil rights movement of the 1940s. And that was the civil rights movement that was deeply motivated by the Black GIs who went into World War II on the slogan Double V, which meant double victory, victory over fascism abroad, and then Jim Crow at home. And the civil rights movement that was led by the two men whose photos are on that page, Walter White, the NAACP. You look at him and you might mistake him for a Caucasian. And actually, he was very fair-skinned African-American, but Walter White amazingly would go undercover in the South, passing as white to collect information on lynchings and other forms of white racist terrorism. And then A. Philip Randolph, who's next to Walter White there, A. Philip Randolph was the leader of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the most important Black labor union. And he was the one who not only put together the 1963 March on Washington, but its inspiration was his planned march in 1940 or 41, which he called off because it was leveraged to get Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was overall kind of shamefully timid on civil rights, to get FDR to at least temporarily desegregate work and defense plans. So you have the story of White, of A. Philip Randolph, of other people, including in Minneapolis, this amazing newspaper publisher named Cecil Newman, who were part of the Black freedom movement of the 40s. And that's a story I really wanted to fill in. And then sort of go to the next one. And then the story of Humphrey is that there was a whole, transformational period, both in his political career and in civil rights in this country, that he had when he was mayor of Minneapolis in the mid-1940s. And I'm not going to go all the way into this deep dive. It's in the book. And by the way, if people go to my website, maybe you can put it up. There's a whole calendar of speaking events I have coming up as well, including some in person, some webinars. But what Humphrey did in taking on a city that, far from the blue Minneapolis you might think of, this is the Minneapolis that was one of the most bigoted cities in the country, deeply anti-Semitic, deeply racist, an abusive police force that anticipates, tragically, the murder of George Floyd. And Humphrey took that on and made Minneapolis, in his just 3 years as mayor, this national model of civil rights and human rights progress. That's what, and now we can go to the next slide, to vault to the end of the book, that's what gave him this opportunity in 1948 to speak to the Democratic Convention at a time when the issue was, will the party endorse civil rights? Because FDR, who'd wanted to appease the Southern segregationist wing to keep its votes, he never took it on, in spite of the fact that the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, was, I think, equaled only by Hubert Humphrey as a white partner in the civil rights struggle with people like Walter White and A. Philip Randolph. But at that convention in 48, the battle is being fought. Truman doesn't want a civil rights plank to mess up his chances for re-election. The Dixiecrats, as Sri said, Strom Thurmond, are threatening to walk out if there's a civil rights plank. A. Philip Randolph is leading protest marches demanding desegregation of the military right outside the convention hall every day with his picket sign. And Humphrey is part of this group of white liberals because at this time, 1,500 delegates at that convention, only 17 are Black. So really, he had to convince white delegates to endorse civil rights, and amazingly carries the day. And again, there's so much more to say that's in the book, but it's a key landmark in civil rights. And it's also a really important example of something Humphrey talked about and Walter White and A. Philip Randolph also commented on, which was the interdependence of mass movements on the outside and also really astute political work on the inside. You need both. They all knew that they needed each other, that one without the other couldn't have accomplished what they did.
Amazing. And I strongly recommend everyone take a look. By the way, Doug Levy is watching from San Francisco. He was up at 8:30. He said hello, but it took me this long. That means 5:30 in California time.
That.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So people watching early. Patricia asks, what chapter of the book would Sam say is one of his favorites? And maybe also a little bit about the reporting methodology. I heard you got access to some great archives and even space to work at the University of Minnesota.
I'll talk about that. I think my favorite chapter is a chapter called The Jim Crow Cars. I think it's chapter 5, and it's a chapter about the year when Humphrey goes to grad school at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge. And that's really the year that begins to make him the person we later recognize, because he's never been outside the North. He's never before lived in a Jim Crow society. But very unexpectedly, that's also the year when he makes Jewish friends for the first time, including people whose family members are in the process of being exterminated in the Holocaust. And it's a year when he studies with this remarkable, partly Jewish, anti-Nazi exile professor named Rudolph Eberle, who teaches Humphrey a lot of really enduring lessons about how democracies can become dictatorships. So that chapter is dear to me. And there's a scene at the very beginning of the first full chapter of the book about the events that lead Humphrey at age 11 to meet the first Black people of his life, who are members of a Black-owned gravel company doing road graveling outside Humphrey's tiny little town in South Dakota. Sri, you asked about the research. So this is a book, unlike many of my others, in which almost all the work was archival. So Humphrey's papers are at the State Historical Society of Minnesota, which is in St. Paul, and there are, I don't know how many hundreds of boxes of them. The film about Robert Caro is called Turn Every Page. I didn't turn every page, but I did turn a lot of pages. And there were other resources out there that I used. I mentioned Cecil Newman, the great Black journalist who was an important friend and influence on Humphrey. Cecil Newman didn't leave archives, but I read on microfilm every word he wrote for publication for various Black newspapers and magazines from 1923, when he started working professionally, until 1948, when my book pretty much ends. And, I went out to the Dakotas a couple of times, to where Humphrey grew up, and did research in the state archives in South Dakota. And kind of the most unlikely thing, sorry, for me to do is part of what happened to Humphrey's family in his childhood was the economic collapse that hit the Dakotas in the 1920s due to falling crop prices, but also a particular disease of the wheat crop called stem rust. And like, I grew up in central Jersey, I grew up in Springsteen country, with malls and chemical plants and sub shops. So this is like way outside my knowledge base. And I can't tell you how much time I spent learning what stem rust is, literally walking wheat fields with agronomists until I could figure it out enough to write it in the book.
Patricia says, thank you for sharing that sneak peek. One of the things I wanted to ask you about is that change that happened in Minnesota, which is now a reliable blue state, which wasn't at the time. What are some lessons that we can take things have changed so much since Humphrey's day, right? But what happened in Minnesota? Of course, a lot of it was him, but so much more would have had to happen. And can we draw any lessons from that to our horrible situation today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, look, Humphrey was someone who contained both real moral fiber, who understood there are issues of good and evil. There are issues of right and wrong. There are issues on which there isn't a middle ground and shouldn't be and can't be. But he also was a very pragmatic politician. He operated in two ways, in his mayoralty, for instance. He did want to change hearts and minds, but he also realized that's not enough by itself. You're not always going to be able to change hearts and minds. You have to change laws that will regulate behavior, that you can urge people to become less bigoted. But you also have to pass a law saying you can't discriminate in hiring, because there's some people who won't change, and the force of law needs to be used to regulate their behavior. And he understood it to work in both ways. he was also a really, really good coalition builder all through his political life. And he, like when he was mayor, the mayor in Minneapolis has very little direct power. The city council does the budget and controls most of the big appointments. So when Humphrey wanted to get through civil rights legislation, he didn't have the votes on the council. So he created these, quote, citizens committees to try to outflank the council and bring political pressure to force them to act, which was successful. But on these citizens committees, he did one for police reform, which tragically he was never able to see through to its conclusion because he went to the Senate so early. And he did another one on civil rights, particularly fair housing and fair employment. And he would get people from labor and management, Christians, Protestants, Catholics, Jews, Nisei Japanese, of which there's a big population in Minneapolis, Jews, blacks, men, women, so people who would be at odds on a number of other issues. But his attitude was, if you can agree on this one thing, if you can agree we need police reform, or if you can agree we need a fair employment law, then let's work on that and lay aside all the other stuff that you disagree on. And that proved to be really, really successful. So I think that's another lesson, is that he had a moral vision, but he didn't operate on the basis of loyalty oaths, permanent loyalty oaths on a whole checklist. He operated on the basis of who can I ally with so we can move forward on these important issues.
There's a famous line about Republicans falling in line and Democrats falling in love. Where do you think that comes from? That many Democrats, liberals, progressives want everything to be that checklist. It has to be 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10, whereas Republicans will take guns, God, abortion, any of those, and then everything else they don't care about.
Well, I think you can almost go back into the 60s for this, a period when the strength of parties is starting to change. And the Republican movement is operating through a very strong young Republicans and college Republicans set of groups, and even kind of the dissident offshoot on the right, Young Americans for Freedom, is oriented towards trying to work within the Republican Party, sort of take it over from within. But it's all about the party as the vehicle. And I think people who are Democrats, by their voting patterns, get involved with issues. They got involved in anti-Vietnam War. They got involved with civil rights. They got involved in the environmental movement, the women's movement, the gay rights movement. And so you have this somewhat unruly coalition of Democrats in which people's kind of first order identity is around an issue and a group of activists on the issue that most captures them, and then it's only secondarily has to do with party building. And I think also, to their peril, Democrats until very recently have ignored down ballot races. I think there was an idea that if we can win the presidency, whether it's with Clinton or with Obama or with the Bernie Sanders movement, or even when Biden got elected, if we win the presidency, other things will fall into line, and maybe pay some attention to the Senate and the House, but definitely, to use the black idiom, sleep it on state legislatures. And that's been catastrophic. And there are people at the very local level now, like David Pepper, who's a writer and activist in Ohio, and Jess Piper, who's a state legislator in Missouri, and I'm blanking, Mallory, what's her last name in Michigan? Anyway, people in state legislatures who watch those elections who are saying to Democrats, hey, the reason we got in the fix we're in is because we didn't turn out in down ballot races. Republicans got supermajorities.
Gerrymandering,
Then use those to gerrymander. That's what we're seeing in Wisconsin now. And then because it's gerrymandered, now it's much harder to rebalance the power. And so belatedly, Democrats are paying attention. But, we're seeing the same thing happening with school boards. Early in my reporting life, I covered education in the suburbs of Chicago. And prior to that, I covered a couple of towns in the suburbs of New Jersey, including the school boards. And even then, like a typical school board election might get at best 20 or 25% of the registered voters, often more like 10%. And in that case, an organized minority like these book banners
Mhm.
and, people who want to, out trans kids and so on, they're going to win if you only turn out 10, 15% of the registered voters. And that's another aspect of sleeping these very local races. And it's going to be vital to start getting people motivated to vote for the school board, for the borough council, for the local legislature in order to reverse the tide.
That's my message to the Indian community that focuses so much on Senate races and, of course, now vice president and all of that. But
Right.
and there are two. I mean, as you know, there are two deplorable candidates running as Republicans for the Republican nomination in Ramaswamy and Haley. But it's the things that it's the local school boards and above. You've got to be involved in every part of the electoral process. And of course, there's a direct line from what you're talking about to the Supreme Court and
Right.
where we are with the Supreme Court and what has happened. Rose Horowitz says, fascinating listening from Connecticut. She has a great show called Women to Follow. So everyone should check that out.
Oh.
And
Rose, I want to tell you something. You should take a look, and I'd love to do your show sometime if you want. Hubert Humphrey had a younger sister who's more like his older sister named Frances Humphrey Howard, who's amazing. I read about her some in the book. She was a protege of Eleanor Roosevelt's. She was active on civil rights before Hubert Humphrey was,
Wow.
and her letters to him when she was living in Washington and working with ER in the 1930s were part of what first got Humphrey alerted to civil rights as a national issue.
Yeah, you were saying ER Eleanor Roosevelt. I was thinking of our colleague from many years ago, ER Ship, as well.
I was just with ER Ship in Baltimore a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, education stories, inspiring or otherwise. This is from 2008. Your piece on education.
That was my final column as the on education columnist.
And would you have predicted then the turmoil with the school boards and the bannings and all of that?
Not to this degree, but when I was a baby reporter covering education in the suburbs of Chicago in the late 70s, early 80s, the county west of Chicago where I worked, DuPage County, even though now it's purple or even blue, at that time was strong Reagan Republican territory and even had like a sort of a Tea Party movement called Taproot that thought Reagan wasn't conservative enough. And there were some battles having to do with what was being taught in the public schools even then, but they pale next to what we're seeing now. So no, I've been shocked, maybe I shouldn't have been, but shocked at the pace at which book banning has happened, at the things that are being banned. Ta-Nehisi Coates' work and Toni Morrison novels and books about Ruby Bridges. I mean, a little girl who desegregated public education in New Orleans. I mean, I remember showing my kids, Aaron and Sarah, back when they were, maybe 8, 10 years old. I think it was a Disney movie, a Disney biopic about Ruby Bridges. It was a great story of American heroism. The idea that this is now something that can no longer be taught is something even with all the right-wing movement in the country, I had not expected to happen to this degree and to happen with such speed.
Well, we're going to take a clip of what you've just said and share it during Banned Book Week, which is coming up on and Let Freedom Read Day, which is October 7th.
I also want to encourage your audience to go to the Penn American Center, which just released a report this past week, their annual report on book banning, which has some really, really, severe news in it, particularly about Florida becoming kind of the national leader in banning. And I'd also say, people want to contribute something materially also to help. Penn and the American Library Association have both been really out at the forefront of this. And you have a period where librarians are being physically threatened. In an op-ed I'd written a few months ago, mostly about what I call stealth book banning, which is when books just aren't ordered or displayed. There's never an official ban, but largely because librarians are afraid of being doxxed and being harassed. I interviewed a terrific librarian in South Louisiana who, has had to have security for herself, who has to, have mace in her purse, who, is subject to harassment at home because she's been willing to be out there publicly fighting against this.
Thank you, Dr. Touch. Neil showing the PEN America website.
Good.
Everyone, please take a look at that.
Banned in the USA.
And Dr. Tachi says, I love the whole concept of Banned Book Week. And Dr. Tachi, who is in Florida, yes, local and state elections are what will make the difference. And one of the things that I think a lot of us who want the right thing to happen think that change, once something happens, then it's a plateau and then we'll keep moving up. But that's not the case. You remember with marriage equality, that day, if you had told me within a few years, we've reached that, but then we'd be backsliding, I would not believe it.
Right. Well, in the op-ed in the Sunday Review section today, I'd encourage people to look at the op-ed along these lines by Jennifer Finney Boylan, who is a colleague of mine. She teaches at Barnard and a really good friend in writing. And Jenny is one of the most important trans public intellectuals out there, and is talking about the scare campaigns both on abortion and about trans rights. But Sri, the point you just made is something I've talked about somewhat with the Humphrey book, and even address a bit in the epilogue, which is that doesn't mean that Humphrey didn't succeed because of where we are now. And I say no, it doesn't mean he failed, but it means that every time in this country we've made progress, there's an inevitable backlash against it. And there's a backlash against Reconstruction, and there was a backlash against mass immigration from, Catholics and Jews from Europe in the 1880 to 1920 period. There's a backlash against the civil rights progress of the 50s and 60s. There's a backlash now against multicultural immigration of the sort that brought your family to America, and the Obama presidency and marriage equality. And so every time there's a backlash, we need to get back to the barricades again. It doesn't mean we failed before, but it means that we can't ever be complacent or think that when you achieve things, per the example you just gave of marriage equality, that means we're going to be fine going forward.
It's almost like it's worse because we've achieved something. People get riled up, and maybe the flip is happening with the Dobbs decision. Because the right has won this, maybe they overplayed it. This is the Jennifer Finney Boylan piece you mentioned, the right's new boogeymen and boogie women. Why have conservatives gone after trans rights like this? Of course, we should also mention this is the week where Rupert Murdoch decided to step down, but he's still around. Of course, he's not gone. The retiring media mogul may hate Trump, but he's too venal to do much about it. He's responsible for us having Trump and other things. And I've been in a little bit of an argument with some people online about Murdoch's legacy. He may have done some things that are good, including maybe saving the Wall Street Journal, the news report, which we love so much. But does that balance out all the damage he's done in the world and in America, UK, US, USA, Australia, everything else?
No, he's been probably one of the most damaging in the media sector.
The most
damaging person on the face of the earth, no question about it. And and of course, as is often the case, the hypocrisy of someone who lives his own life in a certain way, like as the times are, is it James Ponasiak? How is that?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
I'm sorry, James, I can't get it right. But he had a really good piece about Murdoch's legacy, and talks about the fact that here's this globetrotting billionaire who purports to be the foe of the elites. And anyway, I'll let you get on.
No, I was going to say DeSantis, who went to Harvard and Yale, is a person.
Ted Cruz,
like all these people. How is it possible? By the way, our former student Lydia Polgreen, no, I don't want to go on a walk with you, is talking about there's walking is a solo activity and no one is going to convince me otherwise. And she said there's too many invitations to walks, but our friend and dear colleague Ari Goldman and I like to go on walks, and I invite people on walks all the time as well. But but it's readable because it's such a great point of view, and that's of course when when you're teaching, and when I want to look at some of the books you've helped generate. Where do you draw the line between a book that has a point of view and is very clear versus, that view from nowhere? Have you evolved your thoughts on that kind of journalism? As you know, today there's a whole movement against that view from nowhere, that everything has to be in balance. And if 97 scientists say that climate change is real and 3 don't, are we obligated to
Right.
put them both in the story? Can you talk a little bit about
Sure.
that? And I should tell people we have 15 minutes left
Okay.
with the great Sam Freedman.
Okay.
We're going to speed through the rest of the paper, and there's so much to cover. But please go to samuelfriedman.com and check out his website. I'm going to have Neil please put up the website so that you can see all the great work that his students have done. He has done his books, including the one that I first read, Small Victories, The Real World of a Teacher, Her Students, and Their High School is all documented in his website. You can check that out, samuelfriedman.com. And by the way, what Neil's pulling up is actually the website you and I created, hand coding in the year 2000. But Sam hasn't changed. It's a little grayer.
Well, you did
but
the hand coding. I didn't know how to do that.
Exactly. But you sent me the material, and
Yeah.
this was for your book called Jew versus Jew, The Struggle for the Soul of American Jewry. And it had great reviews, and you saw early that the website would be needed to do your kind of work. You have a much better website now. Look at that.
Right. Well, you I think directed me to our wonderful current webmaster, Sarah Graham.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, sir, because you're right. I've never been technically skilled in terms of coding or design myself, but I'm proud to say that you mentioned E.R. Shipp before, who was professor for many years at Columbia, Pulitzer Prize winner for the Daily News. She's now a professor at Morgan State. E.R. Shipp and I were the first Columbia professors to publish online our students' work. That was in the fall of 1995, and our students had to learn how to code their own HTML to get it up there. So, but to your question, first of all, a book should have a point of view. If a book decides to be the view from 30,000 feet, that's a rhetorical choice. That's not a requirement, because as an author, you represent only yourself. Even contractually, if I'm published now by Oxford University Press or previously by Simon & Schuster, I'm not their employee. I'm an independent contractor. They've given me a contract the way they give someone a contract to shampoo the rugs. So I represent myself, and you can be as opinionated as you want, I think, as long as you don't become unbelievable and lose your credibility. In terms of sort of traditional journalism and the struggle within on that, you're very right that there are a couple of different things I want to unpack. One is that even within the most traditional journalistic norms, it's a mistaken application of the principle of fairness and balance to think that everything is 50-50. That's just lazy thinking. So your example of climate change is one actually I have in my book, Letters to a Young Journalist. I'm pretty sure that if the preponderance of scientific opinion is humans have caused climate change, and there are a few outliers, you don't report it as if there is an equal split in opinion. If you want to quote a climate change denier, what's accurate reporting is to say that opinion is shared by only a tiny fraction of climate scientists. So that kind of reporting can exist within the most traditional version of newspaper norms. I think what you're asking about also, which is a very intense topic of discussion in both the pedagogical circles and the journalistic circles I'm in, is what do we do about that ideal of sometimes derided as a view from nowhere, but sometimes thought of as the non-partisan in the non-Fox News meeting, it's termed fair and balanced approach when you're dealing with mass disinformation. And I remember years ago, and this was very prescient, it was 2015, I believe, on the day every spring we give the awards at the journalism school, it's called Journalism Day. And we had a guest speaker, now I'm of course blanking on his name, Jorge, he was either from Univision, anyway, whose speech was about what do you do when you have to cover an autocrat. Now, at this point, Trump had just announced, or maybe not even announced, it was merely rumored he would run, and it was beyond belief that he would ever win. But Jorge was saying, based on his work in Mexico and in South American and Central American dictatorial countries, that the model we taught at Columbia, he didn't single it out to Columbia, but in effect, that's what the implication of his words were, was not suitable for dealing with dictators and autocrats with the spigot, the fire hose of mass disinformation, and that you have to be able to call a lie a lie. You can't treat anti-democratic actors in politics the same as you would treat people who are on the left or the right, but are lowercase Democrats. I think what we're dealing with is very nicely distilled by a line that a friend of mine who's an American-Israeli journalist based in Israel for many years, Yossi Klein Halevi, had about the current crisis in Israel. And Yossi said, this isn't a battle of liberal versus conservative. It's a battle of liberal versus illiberal. Mm. And I think that's what American journalism is struggling with, that, how do you deal with the Trump, of course, but also the claque around him and people like DeSantis as well, and Michael Flynn and, Steve Bannon, the names go on and on. Reporting on them isn't like reporting on Ronald Reagan or Barry Goldwater, and reporting on someone who personally, you might disagree with their politics, but you can, within journalistic norms, say, okay, here's Reagan's argument about a military buildup, or here's Barry Goldwater's, argument against the Civil Rights Act. I might find it abhorrent, but that's different from dealing with people whose whole orientation is to try to destroy democracy. And how do we keep the free media from being the enabler of that? And every time when Trump gets a town hall like he got on CNN, or even this recent interview, even though it was edited before being shown with Kristen Welker, this is the problem. And there were a couple of really smart pieces. One, I mentioned David Pepper before, he either wrote or tweeted this out, and another by Jonathan V. Last in the Bulwark, which is a wonderful Never Trumper web zine and set of podcasts and related content. I love the Bulwark. And they both said the same thing, which is that you can't go through an interview with someone like Trump as if it's a normal politician and let someone say a lie, and even if you briefly challenge it, you're on to your next question, and he's on to his next lie, without ever having, with Jorge Ramos was the person I mentioned before. Sorry for my brain freeze. Jorge Ramos of Univision, but you can't treat the answer as if you can just go on from it, because the lie continues to get traction. And what Pepper and Last both wrote separately was the interviewer should not go to the next question. Mm-hmm. The interviewer should continuously fact check the lie, force either an acknowledgement that it's a lie, or bring the interview to a halt right there. That how is democracy and good journalism served by briefly saying, oh, that's wrong, here's some evidence, but let's go on to my next question. That's not effective, fact checking. That's not journalism of the highest order. So these are the struggles that we're dealing with now.
Yeah, and it's so problematic. Nicole in New Delhi says journalism is up against the human nature to believe what we want to believe. We see this with politics and also with companies like Theranos and Aussie and various NGOs as well. And Rose is quoting you, how do we keep media from being an enabler? Right. And we have so many great comments and questions coming up. But I did want to show, Sam has had almost 100 books published by his students. He's had so many books published, but 100 by his students. I only have a few here, but I wanted to hold them up and have him just quickly say a little bit about each one of them. So here is Shamari Wills's book, Black Fortunes, the story of the first 6 African Americans who escaped slavery and became millionaires. And
Shamari, this is such an example why I love teaching at Columbia. So Shamari, I think, had done a little bit of writing for Caribbean American Weekly before coming to Columbia, but largely, unpublished. That's why I was coming to Columbia J School. And from the first article he did in my basic reporting class, I could see this guy's a real interest in history. And he came up with this fantastic idea for this group biography and pursued it. He went on his own dime to these archives to get his book proposal material pulled together. And the book was published to great reviews, sold really well. It was optioned for cable. I don't know if that adaptation ever has made it out yet or not, but it's a phenomenal book. And even at one point, I remember the Golden State Warriors were assigned to read it as like a team read, I think.
I love that. I love that. I also want to say that this book, which came out now, must be 2014, 2018,
2018.
was the first time, I'm sorry to say, I heard about Greenwood and Tulsa and the massacre there. I'd never heard it in my, relatively deep time in America.
Yeah.
And of course, since then, because of everything that happened in 2020, there's so much more knowledge about the massacre in Tulsa, but I heard about it here. I'm sorry, we got to keep moving. This is Geetika Rudra's book, Here to Stay, Uncovering South Asian American History.
And again, Geetika, I think, had worked in tech before coming to Columbia. I'm not sure how much writing for publication she had done, but I had her, my friend Pharrell Evans and I had her in a class we team taught on writing about race. And she had done some work in that class that had to do with Indian immigration through the West Coast, if I'm remembering correctly. I hope I'm not off on this. And it got her interested, it got me interested, and she'd found some court cases from the early 20th century in which Indian immigrants would go to court to argue over whether they would be construed as white or not, because you had to be construed as white to be able to immigrate. There, by the way, were similar cases involving Arab Americans. Another one of my alums, Alia Malek, one terrific writer who's now on faculty at CUNY. Alia wrote about those cases in her book, A Country Called America. But anyway, so Geetika really followed on from that discovery of that court case to make this wonderful historical narrative of the lives of Indian Americans. And I remember she sent me what was going to be her author bio before the book was coming out, and she described herself something like a historian hobbyist. And I said, you're not like a hobbyist, you've done history. It doesn't matter if you have the degree or not. I mean, you did all the primary source research. So this was a terrific book, and the highlight, I think, in terms of exposure for this was Min Jin Lee, the terrific Korean American novelist, was like a guest book recommender, I think, on, I believe it was Good Morning America, one of the morning shows, recommending some of her favorite books on Asian American experience. And Min, God bless her, recommended Geetika's book, among others.
So a whole generation, it seems, almost before that was Mitra Kalida's book, Suburban Sahibs, which came out of your class.
Right.
And then I don't have that, I couldn't immediately pull it off my shelf, but I have her successor book. It's called My Two Indias, which on the cover has the review of the first book, which came out of your class, as shapely as fiction and as timely as this morning's newspaper, which I think is an amazing blurb. And of course, you and Mitra have done lots of things. So this book is called My Two Indias, a journey to the ends of opportunity. And we actually have a message for you from our friend Mitra. So we're going to play that now.
Right.
Let's see if we can.
Mitra, wherever you are.
Hi, Sam. Congrats on the new book. I will tune in to watch you live, but I also just wanted to tell you that I think of you and your lessons every day when I am writing, reading, reporting, and basically committing journalism. So thank you for all that you have done in my life and career.
Thank you, Mitra. It's one of the joys of my life to have taught students like you. Mitra didn't get one of the 16 4-credit seats in the book class. And I said, I can let you audit, if you're willing to give a whole day to a class you're not even getting credits for. And she did it. And then ultimately someone else in that class had to drop it. I think, if I remember correctly, it was someone who was working on a biography, and the subject of the biography cut off cooperation. So that student's best move was to switch to another class. And Mitra got that seat, and then even with a late start, developed a proposal for what became Suburban Sahibs. And it's a really phenomenal book. It takes this area of Central Jersey, actually right near where I grew up at North Edison, and also areas outside Princeton, like West Windsor Township and East Windsor, that have become exactly what the title hints at, which is this Indian American suburbia. And it was fascinating to me to read the book and be taken in there, because when I grew up, these were sort of the white ethnic suburbs. These were Jewish, Irish, Italian, Polish populations that were there. And then, you look up 20, 25 years later, and it's primarily Indian American.
Sure.
And actually, one of the interesting things is that one of the local high schools in North Edison, John P. Stevens, which when I was growing up, had been kind of like, okay, high school, not great, not by no means bad. But then this influx of Indian immigrant students, it suddenly became like one of the star high schools of the whole state.
Yeah, and then that of course has an impact on people who move there, and
Exactly.
food price value,
Yeah,
housing values, and
right,
things
and same
like that.
thing with West Windsor around Princeton.
Sure.
Because you also, and it's interesting because you have a lot of sort of Rutgers spin-off in North Edison, you have a lot of Princeton spin-off in West Windsor.
Yeah, Neil has put a link to her book page. Mitra says, "Love that he remembers I was a bench warmer." And Dr. Chachi says, "Wonderful." Naomi says, "Informative and entertaining show, one of your best."
Oh,
Kudos to all. I do also want to say that Mitra said, "I'm also a Sam book fan. I have read Small Victories, Upon This Rock, Jew versus Jew, Letters to a Young Journalist, and Who She Was, his memoir on his mom. Prolific writers make prolific readers." But I just want to say, as I say to my children and anyone who will listen, prolific readers make good writers, right? You've got to read in order to write. And that's what I worry about the era of ChatGPT. Everyone thinks they can write. And what are you doing in class? What are your rules?
Yeah.
I know we don't have any time left, but just if you can just cover that.
What I've said, we've had to come up with policies about, ChatGPT. What I've said is think of it akin to Wikipedia, that it's a place to go to ask a research question, but it's not curated. And in fact, there's no human involved, whereas with Wikipedia, it does involve the work of human beings. So I say you can follow the leads it gives you, but you need to verify everything with a curated, gate-kept site. And certainly you can't quote from it or paraphrase from it, because that would be a form of plagiarism. So you could plagiarize an algorithm just as much as you could plagiarize.
Oh, wow. That's a thing that I've not thought of. That's really interesting.
And I said the only basis for quoting from a Chat GPT answer would be if you're writing about, an AI debate and you want to use examples, you quote from them. But you can't use it, from my view, otherwise in your work, and it needs to be in your bibliography.
Wow. So that's really important. We just want to show people the covers of the rest of the sections. This is the Times Magazine, which Sam is a fan of, just as I am. The Kids on the Night Shift for Marcos and thousands of other migrant children doing dangerous jobs that violate child labor laws is the only American dream there is. The New York Times Kids section is not something you could have imagined when you were a reporter at the Times there would be such a thing. But here's a whole section. And this is now showing the day's most important news sold out. And of course, they always say here, this section should not be read by grownups, but we love reading it here. It's the restaurants list 2023, 50 places we're most excited all across America. And you're on a speaking tour, which means you're on a food tour.
Well, I know, I'm not that, I like eating well, but I'm not like one of those super foodies. So
okay. And if you can make it here, great design for a great city, New York City, of course. Where else? This is the New York Times Style magazine. The real estate cover is a woof over their heads. When you live in a city with a big dog, winning control of your couch is only part of the challenge. And here is Sean Combs doesn't need to ask anyone for anything is what this says, with a new album and a fresh sense of purpose. All right. And then the Metropolitan section, which is only available to home delivery folks in the tri-state area. The year Lou Reed gave up on music.
That was a terrific piece.
And you read it somewhere else, obviously.
I read it online the other day.
Yeah.
It's an excerpt from a forthcoming biography
Nice.
of Lou Reed, and I thought it was really terrific, and it even compelled me to stream on Apple Music an album of Lou Reed, The Velvet Underground, live at Max's Kansas City, which the article mentions.
Nice. Latino residents challenge a town's voting system in Sleepy Hollow in Westchester. And the Sunday business cover, James Dolan's Moonshot, a man who controls a Madison Square Garden, is opening an arena in Las Vegas that he hopes will revolutionize live entertainment. Back in New York, he faces the wrath of lawyers, politicians, and sports fans. This man's a big sports fan of the Giants.
Yes.
I know they had a rough first game, but how do you feel about the rest, how they're doing?
I think it's a one-game season as we play the Seahawks
Today?
A week from Monday
Oh,
night.
okay.
They have to get back to 2-2. They have to
Okay.
get their defense and their offensive line corrected. And Sri, you are one of my many good friends who's a Jets fan, and I've never rooted against the Jets because I've such good friends who are Jets fans. I just feel in mourning for you.
I got to say, I've written critically of Mr. Rogers on his non-sports side,
Right.
because he's one of those people who did his own research, and we know what happened. The mother of eclectic design, Kelly Werstetler, resists labeling her style, but she follows an old soul, new spirit philosophy. So I always like looking through that. So we're out of time, but I did want to mention two books. One that we hope to have Peter Hotez, Dr. Hotez, speaking of bad science by Aaron Rodgers, The Deadly Rise of Anti-Science, a Scientist's Warning. Watch for this. We hope to have him on our show. We've had him before. And I should say, one of the few people who was non-Indian who knew who Abe Verghese was and was a fan, who invited him to talk and teach and everything else very early, was Sam Freedman. And this doorstopper of a book has had an incredible run, including the book before, Cutting for Stone, which is on his fiction. But you found him when he was a nonfiction writer.
Yeah, his first book is extraordinary. It's called My Own Country, and it's about his experience doing AIDS
in Johnson City,
AIDS
Tennessee.
care, in rural part of East Tennessee that had an outbreak of AIDS really, really early on. It was not a big city that was not known as a particular center of gay life. And because he was there on, I think, an immigrant work visa and, had to go to a high needs place to be able to practice medicine, it's an extraordinary book. And I would urge people to read it.
Yeah. This is what Vikram Seth said about his book, his own book, which was the longest novel since Richard Sheridan's Clarissa. He said you should buy it, then take a razor blade and then cut it and then carry it around, and that would force you to buy a second copy, is what he said. Though I don't think Abe needs any help with more copies. But everyone, please get Sam's great new book, which is about Hubert Humphrey. It's called Into the Bright Sunshine.
Into the Bright Sunshine.
Into the bright sunshine. There it is. Samuel G. Freedman, young Hubert Humphrey, and the fight for civil rights. We're going to give Sam a second to just gather his thoughts, because we're going to ask him for a writing tip before he leaves. And Neil and I are going to do a couple of quick housekeeping things, and he's going to come back. So we're going to give you a second, Sam, to just gather your thoughts. We're going to write back. And I want to say thank you all for watching. Thank you, Neil. What a great show. We learned so much, and we covered so many people and places that are things that are so familiar to us.
Absolutely. And I thought it was great. As someone who never went to journalism school, I feel like I'm living vicariously through you and your students, hearing Mitra talk about the class with Sam, and hearing all about the books that he helped foster and develop through that course.
Good books,
which is just incredible. A couple of quick announcements, Sri, just so folks know. We have a great show planned next week as well. Excuse me. Our guest will be Irene Mushemi Ndritu. She is the author of Lucky Girl, and I want to give you just a quick background. Lucky Girl, the description: longing for independence, a young sheltered Kenyan woman flees the expectations of her mother for a life in New York City that challenges all her beliefs about race, love, and family. Irene was born and raised in Nairobi and moved to the States in 1998 for college. She went to the
J School,
Columbia J School, and has worked as a journalist in New York City, Washington, D.C., and Boston. This is her debut novel. So we definitely look
8:30 a.m. on Sunday next week.
8:30 next week. We encourage you to join us for that. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, Muckrack is a sponsor of Sri's New York Times Read Along. We always appreciate the support that we get from Muckrack. And the show is produced by Digimentors, the consulting firm that Sri started with his friend and colleague from Columbia, Andrew Lee, that I joined as a VP of Events and Communications during the pandemic. So thank you very much for all of your support and for watching today's show. As you know, the show will repeat as soon as we're finished. Just a few minutes later, you can watch from the beginning on Facebook, on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on YouTube, on our Digimentors website, wherever you're watching from. You'll want to catch the whole show. You really will.
Absolutely. And I'm just going to bring Sam back in here just to
Please.
show. Arlene says, My Own Country is a fabulous book, very
Yeah.
sensitively written. Mary says, have to admit, I'm worried about the backlash, the meanness, and too few Humphreys. That's a reason for everyone to read the book. Good night from Delhi, eternally wistful that I can't get a print Sunday New York Times here. Rose from Connecticut, great to see Sri and Sam together in person. Wonderful and rich show. And Liz says, thanks so much for a memorable show. Wishing everyone a good new year, which is,
Thank you.
of
May
course,
we all be written in the book of life.
And I'm going to now put Sam on a close-up so that he can give us one writing tip out of the thousands in his head, a writing tip, a tip to think about for all of us watching who can't get into his classes.
All right. Don't write for lines, write for total story. I think a lot of people think that, you should have a pithy phrase or come up with some little fillip of language, and that's what makes writing succeed. But really, it's writing for the total trajectory of the story you're telling. And that's true of fiction, that's true of nonfiction, it's true of a personal essay, it's true of reportage. So that would be my one tip to pass along.
All right. So I'm going to come over here and say thank you, everyone, for watching. 8:30 to 10 a.m. Eastern Time on Sundays. This is the New York Times Read Along. That's Sam Freedman. Check out samuelfriedman.com and check out his book, everybody. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us, everybody. And thanks, Sri and Neil.
This is so much fun. Thank you, and thanks, everybody. Bye.